Welcome, friends, dear friends and neighbors, very dear friends. When Bill and I dreamed together of a Great Issues lecture series, it was our hope that each lecture would make people think about our country, our world, and our place in each. After 3 lectures on politics, civil discourse, and anti-Semitism, today we get to that place about ourselves. In this, our 4th year, I must express my thanks to Rabbi Walk, my children, John, Lily, Andrea, and Doug, and most especially to Josh Weiss. He is actually the heart and soul and the captain of our team. It was also Bill's wish that the talks be here at Bethel, our spiritual home, and as a place of learning as well as a place of observance. We're delighted that you're here. Today, you're sharing the rest of Bill's dream. Thank you.
So before we begin, I just want to say a word about transitions. Don't worry, I know who the expert in the room is today on transitions, but I laughed a little bit. We had a bat mitzvah yesterday in the afternoon, and a cousin of the bat mitzvah, I think it is, led Havdalah, and she took the words out of my mouth. She talked about the fact that Judaism anticipates transitions, and that Judaism tries to identify them, and that our rabbis long ago understood that transitions can be hard. It says in the Talmud, Kol hatchalot kashot, the beginnings are difficult. And what the rabbis actually understood about this idea that the beginnings are difficult is that being in transition is difficult. The rabbis were the master of this when it came to issues around death and dying, because they experienced it that. They anticipated the idea of what does it mean to have an adult child. They named it at the bar and bat mitzvah. But that the whole idea of the ceremony was to mark the fact that this little child that you once had isn't a little child, but is becoming an adult. And those of you who have had children, it is a transition to go from a child who you can tell what to do to a child who has his or her own ideas and how you live with that. The transitions the rabbis identified both for the individual and for the community. And the truth is, one way to study and to think about this would be to go and study Talmud. But that's really hard, and that's where Bruce Feiler's work and his idea of the whole notion of what he writes is an accessible piece for us to wrestle with a very Jewish idea. So what I want to do is just say, as we have this conversation about transitions, I want us to be thinking about what it is our tradition offers us and how our tradition can be a tool in helping us navigate life's journey, the most wonderful aspects of the journey, and then some of the more complicated aspects. Thank you again for being here. Thank you to Lynn and Zichrono Livracha, to Bill, who had a vision for what they could bring to this community with their generous philanthropy and their extraordinary love of our community.
So, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. So my name is Josh Weiss, and I've had the pleasure of working with the Foggles on this series, and it's been great. I really have enjoyed doing it. We've had some terrific speakers, and Bruce is right up there with the best of them. Before I tell you a little bit about his bio, so I met Bruce 15 years ago, and Bruce has done some amazing things in his life, but he's a better human being than he is everything else. So you need to understand that. That's not in his bio. And so I have a great affection for Bruce. He's a really great person, and I hope you get a chance to see that, and I'm sure you will. He is also perhaps the best storyteller I've ever heard. And so he's going to share a lot of different stories with you about his work. And what I love about his work is it's about helping people, and he does that so very well. So Bruce has written a number of books. he started his sort of professional career, if I can put it that way, traveling with the circus. Now, not a lot of people do that, but that's what I love about Bruce, is he started there, then he went to the Middle East and walked the Bible. Again, not your typical kind of things. And then he transitioned to focusing on the family and the society here and understanding what's going on here and how do I help people with some of the challenges they face. And so he's going to talk to us and I think weave together a number of his books that really deliver some wonderful life lessons and advice for all of us that we can all use as we try to manage our way through some crazy times. I will say also that Bruce has done a number of TED Talks. He has a TED course called How to Master Life Transitions, and he has a new book coming out called The Search, which I'm sure he'll mention. And he's got, I think the biggest transition for you is that he's got 2 kids, 2 twin daughters who are going off to college. So he's got an empty nest coming, and that's a transition in and of itself. So please, and let me just say a quick note about the format. So Rabbi Walk and I are going to sit up here with Bruce and do a little bit of a fireside chat. So if you can imagine a fireplace behind us, that would be lovely. And we're going to try to talk for half an hour, 45 minutes, and then open it up to questions from all of you. So please be thinking of the things that you'd like to ask, and feel free to make it personal as well, because I think we all learn when that happens. So without further ado, Bruce.
Good morning, everybody. If I've learned anything, is this on? I was just going to say, if I've learned anything being in a lot of synagogues, it's don't open up room temperature and microphone volume to public discussion. Is this going to work, or do we want to use the is this
No, I think it
working?
works.
I think you're okay.
Well, before we get started, let me just, since I've now been talked about multiple times here, let me take the microphone and thank all of you for coming out. What a beautiful day. It finally feels like spring. Often it feels like we go from winter to summer. It feels like this year we went from winter to wet, whatever that is, but we have spring, and thank you for coming out on this beautiful spring day. Let me acknowledge and thank the Foggles. We have 5 Foggles here today, and I know there are more out there, but we remember Bill Foggle and the spirit of community that has brought us here, and in my conversation with Lynn this morning, the spirit of transition that your family, as my family, and all of our families are in right now. And this beautiful room has also been in a transition, I understand, in the last few years. So thank you for including me and inviting me, and I'm happy to go wherever you guys want to lead.
Great. So we've already started talking about the idea of transitions. So maybe, Bruce, I know when you talk about there's a specific meaning to that. So I'm wondering if you could start by sharing, what do you mean by life and transitions? And maybe, you've got lots of stories about this. Maybe share a story that for you typifies that.
Well, let me start with my own story and how I sort of accidentally ended up in the middle of this conversation about life transitions. I can't remember if it was mentioned this morning, but I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, 5 generations of Jews in the American South, in Mikveh Israel Synagogue. Who's been here? A lot of people go to Savannah traveling. Yeah. So the story, for those of you who don't know it, since we're in a synagogue, I'm going to divert a bit, is that the oldest synagogue is Shehereth Israel in New York, and the second is in Rhode Island. And how did the third end up in Savannah, Georgia? The answer to that is that there were Catholics in Florida in the 1730s, and there were Protestants in the Carolinas. And Georgia, which was the 13th of the 13th colonies, taken from debtors out of prison, said no papists, no Catholics, right? No slaves, interestingly enough, and no Jews. But then there was a ship of Portuguese Jews from London that was on its way to the Caribbean, where there were many Jews, and it blew off course and ended up off the coast of Savannah in July of 1733. And the colony had been founded in February of 1733, and there was one doctor, and he had been killed in an outbreak of yellow fever. And like cliche of all cliches, there was a doctor on the ship of Jews. And so they said, would you come in and take care of the colony? And as I'm fond of saying, the doctor said it was the opposite of Moses, it was let my people in. So the doctor came in, saved the colony. They set up Congregation Mikveh Israel, and my family grew up in that congregation. My father was its president in the 70s. My mother was its first female president in its 250-year history. And so I grew up 5 generations of Jews in Georgia, and I left there and went, Josh and I were just talking, I went to Yale, and I left there and I went to Japan, and I started writing letters home on crinkly airmail paper. I mean, I'm happy to be in a room where I don't have to explain what airmail paper is. For anybody under a certain age doesn't know what that was. And when I got back to Georgia, 6 months later, everyone said, I loved your letters, and I was like, great, have we met? And it turned out that my grandmother had Xeroxed them and passed them around, and they went viral in a sort of 1980s sense of the word. And I thought, well, I should write a book about this. And it doesn't happen this way, but I sold my first book at 24, 35 years ago, and I've never held a job since. So in my 20s, I wrote, and I'm the one who just wrote a book about work, Josh, and I've never held a job, but except as a circus clown, as you said. Anyway, so in my 20s, I wrote books about Japan and England, and I spent a year in the circus. In my 30s, I went back and forth to the Middle East writing these books, Walking the Bible and Abraham, and hosting television about the Bible and trying to bring these stories to life. And the reason I'm going into this long story is because it explains a little bit about the transitions. And so I think of this now as a classic linear life. Like I figured out what I wanted to do early, I did it for no money, I had some success, I got married and had children. This is the fantasy linear, kind of upward trajectory that we all would like to have. But then in my 40s, my life just got completely blown up. First, I got cancer at 43 as the new parent of 3-year-old identical twin daughters. As some of you may know, I asked a group of male friends to be supportive to my children, and I call this group of men the Council of Dads, which went on to become a TV series on NBC. I had financial troubles because my family owned a bunch of real estate in Georgia that was wiped out by the recession. And then my father had Parkinson's and got very depressed and tried to take his own life 6 times in 12 weeks. So I'm a storyteller, and I'm a public person, and here's a story that I didn't want to tell and I didn't know how to tell. And when I did, what happened was a little bit what happened to me when I came into this building this morning, is that everybody had a similar story of how their life was upended in a way that they did not anticipate. I was actually at a college, my 30th college reunion in New Haven, and I was on my way, and I was moderating a panel, as the two of you are, of prominent people from my classroom, and I was on my way up, and a friend of mine was driving, and he was closing a $400 million real estate deal. He was on top of the world, and he was talking about this, and then toggling to another set of phone calls where one of his partners had a 9-month-old, and the 9-month-old had gone down for a nap the previous day and never woken up. And so he was like ebullient and weeping at the same time. So I'm in a room like this, you have a lot of people, and I have their resumes, just like you had my resume, and I literally ripped up the resumes, and I was like, losers don't come to their reunion. I don't want to hear about your successes. I want to hear about your struggles, what keeps you awake at night, and what's scary to you. And that night it took me 2 hours to walk from one end of the reunion to the other because person after person had a similar story. I'm being sued for malpractice. My wife went into the hospital and died the next morning. My daughter tried to cut herself, and on and on and on. And I literally called my wife as I left that, and I said, I'm sitting on the biggest story. No one knows how to tell their story anymore, and I have to do something about it. So what I did is what you alluded to, Josh, is I created this thing that I've now called the Life Story Project. And I began to collect life stories of Americans of all corners of the country, all walks of life, all 50 states, all sorts of backgrounds. And I collect these stories and I analyze them and I look for patterns. In the field of narrative psychology, which is sort of a field that has grown in prominence in the last 3 decades, an average paper will have 10, 12 of these life stories. I've done 400 in the last 6 years. And I wasn't looking for transitions. Okay, that's just the long way of saying all I did was I went looking for how do you tell your story when you don't know how to tell your story? That was the question. What happens when you lose the plot? And what happened was I'm sitting there day after day doing 2 or 3 of these things a day and hearing these stories, and it was very clear to me that this was the thing, that there are these moments in our lives when we're stuck and we don't know what to do. And the way people tend to describe this is I'm off schedule, or I'm off kilter, or I'm off track in some way. The life I'm living is not the life that I expected to be living. That's the way people, and as we unpack this in the course of the next hour, I actually think that the biggest word in that sentence is the expect. It's that our expectations are what's wrong here, not life. And we can talk about that in a second. So then what became clear, so I would say just from a high level point of view, I learned 3 things from this experience in the first few years of doing this. Thing number 1, the linear life is dead, okay? And and here's the thing that's important about it. The linear expectation that I'm talking about, that turns out to be a historical aberration, actually. So if you go back to the ancient world, we're in a sanctuary, rabbi, if I can, preach for a second. In the ancient world, they did not have linear time, right? The way you look at the world affects how you look at your life. And the way they looked at the world was through agriculture, because that's what it was. So that's a cycle, right? That's every year is a cycle, right? To every season, turn. Interestingly enough, it's actually the Hebrew Bible that introduces the idea of linearity, right? Because the Hebrew Bible does something that had never been done before, which is embed history in a family, right? So Adam and Eve, I wrote a book about Adam and Eve called The First Love Story, and that's the first time that the creation of humans actually has characters, they're named, they have stories, they have flaws, we all know. And then, of course, we have the line of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and on down the line, right? And of course, Christianity picks up on that and Islam does. But that's a linear line, and that had never existed before in human history, right? So in the ancient world, they thought the life was a cycle. And in the Middle Ages, when, the descendants of the Hebrew Bible were ruling in the West, they think that life is a staircase up to middle age, and middle age is the peak, and then it's down, straight down after that, okay? And if you look, in fact, in the book that's out there, there's pictures of this. So what does that mean? That means, no new life at 50, no, starting a new job at 60, right? No moving to Florida, and opening an Airbnb or a B&B or whatever it might be, right? It's straight up and straight down. And what's interesting is that's the opposite of the way we grow up, where middle age was said to be the bottom. Okay, so the idea of linearity, a linear life, that really is only invented in the 19th century with the birth of industrialism and a conveyor belt and the idea of things moving along in a factory, okay? So all the ideas about life in the 20th century are linear, right? So you've got Piaget with childhood development, Freud, that we have these psychosexual stages, Erikson, the 8 stages of moral development, right? The 5 stages of grief, the hero's journey. These are all linear constructs, phase after phase after phase, okay? That had never been talked about, but we all think that's the only way to live, and it's not, it's wrong. But this reaches its peak in the 70s with Gail Sheehy, who actually plagiarizes research done at Yale and UCLA to introduce the idea of a midlife crisis. And the idea of the midlife crisis is that we all do the same thing in our 20s, the same thing in our 30s, and then have a midlife crisis between 39 and 44 and a half. That's how precise it was. This is total, I won't use a bad word because I'm sitting in a synagogue, but this is bunk. It is not true. But we all grew up believing it was true. Take the pandemic, right? If you were between 39 and 44 and a half, you're having a crisis. But if you were between 27 and 36, you're having a crisis, or 57 and 62, or in the case of my 15-year-olds, 15 to 18, right? These events happen whenever. And so big idea number 1 is that the linear life is dead. The second is that the nonlinear life involves many more transitions. And then the third idea, and we can unpack this wherever you guys want to go, is that transitions are a skill that we can and must master. So that shifted the work between, okay, we all have these things coming at us all the time. How is it that we can learn to navigate them better? Because we all are so overwhelmed when we get into them.
So can you unpack for a bit what makes transitions so difficult for people? Once you tell us that, then you can tell us how we manage them.
Yeah, right. I think that's a great question. So I think, look, well, let me just first of all let's just crunch a few numbers here, okay? So based on these stories, so I have 1,500 hours of interviews, 10,000 pages of transcripts, and then we've analyzed them kind of to death. And here's what you need to know. The average person goes through 36 what I call disruptors in the course of their lives. Okay, that's an event. It could be a fender bender, as small as a fender bender or twisting your ankle, okay? Or it could be as big as losing a loved one or a tornado takes the roof of your house off, okay? Now, most of these we get through with relative ease, okay? And, we're pretty good at navigating transitions. But 1 in 10 of them becomes what I call a lifequake, okay? And that's a massive burst of change that becomes sort of overwhelming. And I would say that if there is a signature piece of data from all of this work, it's that the average lifequake lasts 5 years. So if you think 3 to 5 of these in the course of a lifetime, 4, 5, 6 years, that's 25 years. That's half of our adult lives we spend in transition. And so I think that the first answer to the question of why we're so overwhelmed is because of how we talk about this, right? What are the pop words you hear in the culture all the time? Grit, right? Resilience, okay? Stick-to-itiveness. That we're told that these are miserable periods that we have to grit and grind and resilience our way through. But let's just take the word resilience in and of itself. That turns out to be a linear word. The word actually comes from a spring. It's an industrial world. A spring, you pull a spring back, and the amount of resilience in the spring is how quickly it bounces back to its original shape. Well, I don't have to tell you this, but I will put it into words. When you go through a transition, you may bounce back, but far more of us bounce sideways or forward or a different direction entirely. So the idea, what we've done is we've normalized, I would almost say fetishized, the stable periods, and we've stigmatized, and made horrendous the unstable periods, and that's the problem. Okay, that's problem number 1, right? So again, if you look at let's just talk Bible for a second, if I could, in your home, Rabbi. If you look in the biblical story, right, it's full of instability, of course, and the greatest moments of growth are in the instability, right? Abraham leaves his father's house, goes to the unknown, leaves his family, goes to the unknown, God doesn't even bother to tell him where he's going. He just says, go forth and I'm going to tell you, you have to trust me, okay? Then they go down, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they go down, right, hundreds of years in slavery, and then they go out into the wilderness. They originally, what do they want to do? They want to go back, right? Take me back even to slavery to eat onions and leeks because it's better than what they got in the desert. But of course it's in the desert where they get the 10 Commandments and the laws and they become a nation. In fact, God says you have to spend longer in the desert, right? Then they're in the settled land, and then of course the land is overthrown and they go by the rivers of Babylon and weep, we are told. But what do they also do? They invent Shabbat, right? They invent the cycle. So in the periods of instability, in the founding story of Western civilization, the growth is in the periods of wilderness, in the periods of dislocation. So I think that the first problem we have is that we are scared. And then I would say the second problem we have, just to kind of sharpen the point and then we can move on, is that people tend to do one of two things when they get into a life transition, right? Either, and maybe we'll do a show of hands, either they make a 212 item to-do list. This is Josh. I'll call you out, Josh. So you make a 212 item to-do list and you say, I'm going to be great at it and I'm going to get a blue ribbon and I'm going to be the best ever. I'm going to get through it in a weekend, right? Because you teach negotiation and you break it down into tools and skills, and so you say, I'm going to be great at it, okay? The other way people do is they lie under the covers in the fetal position with a cat, and they say, I can never get through it, and woe is me. That's you? Okay, fine. So I knew it. I don't know you well enough. I know Josh well enough. As exemplary as a human being as you are, Josh, you're going to break it down and you're going to go at it, right? Both of these are wrong, actually. But in fact, when we turn, Rabbi, to the question of how, I think we have to realize should we do a show of hands? Yeah. Let's do a show of hands. Who's the 212 item to-do list person that thinks that they're going to be really efficient and better at it, okay? And who's the lie under the fetal position in the cat? Okay, look at this. This is almost exactly 50-50, because the people who didn't raise their hands, you're the fetal position type, I know. It's somehow okay to be a to-do list person, but it's not okay to be an I'm emotionally overwhelmed person. So I'm counting those of you who didn't raise in the second group. Okay, so the point is that, and this is the problem, is that we are overwhelmed because we are conditioned to think that they're rare, that they reflect poorly on you, and that you won't get through them. I think that's the problem, which leads us to what this work is about, which is trying to destigmatize, talk about the patterns, and give people the tools to manage them, more effectively.
So, given all that, but one of the things you talk about is that stories are critically important in helping you to get through these.
Yes.
Right? That's one of the tools.
Yes.
So, what is it about stories that helps us?
And what kind of stories, right?
Let me start with a story. Not a story of a person, but I'll make up a story about myself. It's spring. Let's do it. Let's do let's do a spring story. It's springtime. We're in California. We've had the biggest rains in a generation. Okay? It's what's it called? The great bloom? Mm-hmm. The big bloom, the great bloom? The great bloom is upon us. Okay, we get the family, this is our family, we get the family in the car, we drive up to the mountainside where we're told all the wildflowers in bloom, we park in a parking lot, we walk around the corner, what do we see? As I'm telling this story from my brain, your brain is finishing that story. We are wired for story. One of the reasons that the idea of storytelling has emerged in the last generation is that we can now look inside the human brain. And we know that we are wired to process the world in stories. Now I'm going to finish that story. It's a beautiful day. It's finally spring. The great bloom is upon us. We're going to get the family in the car. We're going to drive up to the hills. We park in a parking lot. We walk around their hill. And what do we see? A giant pile of donuts. So what's just happened? I'm telling a story, and your brain is finishing the story, and then what arrives in the middle of the story, but something that you don't expect. And what do you all do? You laugh, you raise your eyebrows, you perk up, okay? You want to pay attention more because now there is tension in the story, okay? What a lifequake is, what a death of a loved one, a downsizing, a tornado, a layoff, the birth of identical twins, a car crash. What that event is a pile of donuts in our story. And the essence of storytelling is how you navigate the pile of donuts. Because what am I going to do with this pile of donuts? Okay? I can turn around and say, oh, we're not going to see the bloom. I'm going to get back in my car and go home. Okay? That's the equivalent of lie in the fetal position under the cat, with the cat and say, I can't handle it. Okay? We can walk around the pile of donuts, but that seems to be a waste because then we're ruining a perfectly good pile of donuts. I grew up in Krispy Kreme territory. Or we can eat the donuts. Well, but there's a lot of them. Or we could take the donuts and share the donuts with other people out trying to feel. So how you handle the pile of donuts is the essential task of life, okay? So what storytelling is learning to do this when the pile of donuts is not on the path to the bloom, but is on the path to some happiness that you expected. And therefore learning to deal with the plot disruption is the essential task of life. Because what we've learned in the rise of narrative psychology, along with the rise of neuroscience, is that the story, that you all have a story. If you stop for a second and stop listening to me and listen to the story that's going on in your head, like who you are and where you came from and what's important to you and what you want to be doing, not just this afternoon, but in the next few years of your life. Okay, if you got a call right now that a loved one was in the hospital, what would be going through your head? That is the story of who you are. And what we've learned in the last few years is that story is not part of you, it is you in a fundamental way. That life is the story that you tell yourself. And the essence of being alive is learning to tell that story in an effective way, understand where you came from, and then deal with the piles of donuts that life is going to throw at you. I mean, just a quick note about the present, because you and I were emailing in anticipation of this, and for those of you who haven't seen, or maybe maybe this is registered because we're in Massachusetts, that Harold Kushner died a week ago, 9 days ago on Friday. And of course, Harold Kushner, for those of you who don't know, was the rabbi of a synagogue in Natick, Massachusetts. And when his wife gave birth to their second child, a daughter, and 12 hours later, Rabbi Kushner and his wife Suzette learned that their son, Aaron, who was 3 years older, had progeria, which is a sort of a rapid aging, and he would not live into his teens. And in fact, he died at 14, not long after, I think they had a bar mitzvah, if I'm not mistaken, from the book. And Rabbi Kushner sat down 4 years later and wrote the book When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Now, you and I were emailing because I wrote a piece about this on social media, and I write a newsletter called The Nonlinear Life, which you all can subscribe to, on Substack. It's brucefeiler.substack.com, I believe, about this. And you reached out and said that you were in the it was your childhood synagogue. And in fact, I'll let you tell the story, so I don't tell the story of your personal connection. But the reason that book went on to sell 4 million copies and become sort of one of the defining books of contemporary Judaism is because he says the question everybody wants to ask is why? Do bad things happen to good people? And that's not the question, because every good person has bad things happen to them, and every bad person too. I suppose we could say, the question is, what do you do when bad things happen to you? And that's the essence of what we're talking about. What do you do when you get the pile of donuts? And do you want to share, even though you've got a microphone, would you want to share the story? Because I think it's relevant to what we're talking about.
I can. So that was my synagogue growing up, and Rabbi Kushner was obviously, a powerful figure and a very eloquent rabbi. But there was I always felt a little bit of a connection that he and I had, because I was actually born just with my thumb. And when the things that happened with Aaron, there was sort of almost a sense as if there was something that he could relate to me about it. And even though my struggle, whatever that looked like, wasn't at all, paled in comparison to what Aaron was going through, there was something there. And I always noticed that he sort of went out of his way to recognize that with me. And what I learned from that, and I learned from the world around me as well, was exactly the idea of how do you manage that? Because anybody who has, I guess what today is called a difference, just wants to be treated in a normal way, wants to be treated like everybody else. They don't want to be treated differently. And I think that was the thing with Aaron that I noticed, and that he really went to great lengths to normalize his life while he was alive. And did all kinds of things that helped, I think, the congregation to understand that at a time maybe when that wasn't the way that we were coming out of an era when differences was dealt with very differently. And so it had a profound impact on me, and as well, like with my parents, that was the same message, was you can do whatever you want to do. And I think it was interesting and incredibly valuable for me to have somebody like him who was reinforcing that message.
And I think that's, I'm going to let you ask your question, Rabbi, but I want to sharpen this point, because you said I've just written this book called The Search, which is about finding work that brings you meaning. And maybe the heart of the idea is that fewer people are searching merely for work anymore. More people are searching for work with meaning. that we're moving from a means-based economy to a meaning-based economy, and that the most important way to identifying what is it that brings you meaning, which is the essence of what this book that comes out in 3 weeks is to go into your childhood pains and identify what is the story you've been trying to tell. And so it's just the reason I said to sharpen it is here you have grown up to be, not only just an empathic person, but somebody who tries to bring people and bridge conflicts as a negotiator. And it's not hard for me, who listens to these stories all day, every day, to see this connection between what he helped you see in your own difference and your life's work, which is bridging differences between and among people. That's the potential here. The potential here is not try to blow through it in a weekend and not try to sit under the covers and say, I can do nothing about it, but to turn this pain into growth and renewal in some way. It's exactly what you and I were discussing this morning, Lynn.
So I just want to go back to the plate of donuts for a minute.
Please. I never said plate, okay? I think that says a lot about you.
No.
You're going to eat it.
No, but I'm really thinking, I want to understand and ask for a little more precision. So I'm on this path and I'm expecting to see the great bloom, and instead
Yes.
I see the plate of donut, or I see this
Pile
mountain
of
of
donuts,
donuts. Is it wise to say I was really hoping to see
Yes.
the bloom, but I guess I'll eat a donut? Or like, how do you manage expectations
Nice.
with the curveballs?
Yes.
Because it just feels like there's a lot there that you have to say about it, and if you could unpack it for us.
You're good at what you do. I love that. Because you still want the bloom, and now you've got the donuts, and how are the two connected? So let me answer that this way. So what I've talked about is a life in which there are 36 disruptors, and there are 3 to 5 life quakes in the course of a life. But not all life quakes are bad. And I think so I set out to categorize what are the life quakes that we experience. And I did it on 2 axes, if you will. One was voluntary and involuntary. Okay, the reason that I don't like, and I struggled with, things like curveball or crisis, or all of these words tend to read negative, right? So a life quake, so it turns out that basically, 40, I forgot the number off the top of my head, but it's something like 47% are voluntary and 53% are involuntary. So what is an involuntary life quake? An involuntary life quake is you lose your job, okay? You get a diagnosis, okay? You lose a loved one. Your spouse cheats on you. But that's only 53% of them. 47% of them are voluntary. And in many cases, some of those are even joyful. Like, okay, so it's you quit a job because you want to do something else. You move to a different area because you want to change. You cheat on your spouse, okay? Right? That's a voluntary life quake. I mean, this will be a theme, I suppose, in this conversation. I'm the parent of identical twin daughters. They just turned 18. They are dancing today in their final ballet recitals, which I did not know when I committed to this, so I'll be leaving here to go catch the last 2 this afternoon and this evening back in Manhattan. We live in Brooklyn, but I'm the parent of identical twin daughters. Like, trust me, it was joyful. It was a life quake. I mean, everything got upended. So that was one pole, okay? And it was interesting because I looked at this. I was doing this in my 50s, and I looked at this and I was like, wow, that's great. Like, we are embracing the opportunities of the nonlinear life. I mean, let's just talk to women, right? I mean, because work is on my mind, because I'm about to launch this book on work on Good Morning America in a few weeks. A lot of women of a certain generation, including many women in this room, if you wanted to spend time with your children and you stopped when you had children, if you were lucky enough to have children, most of the time, if you were lucky enough to have children and you got off the path, you did so with the expectation that you couldn't get back on the path. I mean, what a squandering of human potential. And we now know that you can get back on the path because there's no path, right? So this is an opportunity of voluntary. I had a bunch of 20-somethings on my team, and we were analyzing them, and they looked at this and they were like, whoa, 53% are involuntary? Like all those life plans I'm making where everything is gonna go perfectly are not gonna come true? Like, so it's interesting, the generational difference. So that was one axis. The other axis I did was personal versus collective, okay? So a personal life quake is something that just affects you, okay? Or, or your family, right? So that's, again, the diagnosis or the accident or, the move or whatever. A collective life quake is a natural disaster, right? Or a recession or a war. 95%, I did this in the 2017, 2018, I started this process. And 95% were personal and 5% were collective. And I thought, well, I've just wasted a whole metric of analysis. Like we did this whole analysis. And there's a throwaway line in the book, Life is in the Transitions, which is if, had I done these interviews a century earlier, right? 2 world wars, depression, women's rights, gay rights, Vietnam, like there would have been many more collective involuntary life quakes. I finished the book in 2019. It was scheduled to be published actually this week, May 12th, 2020. It did not get published on May 12th because the world was in quarantine and in lockdown and there were no bookstores, okay? And we ended up publishing it. And so suddenly, I was sitting like from a kind of moment in life, like with the idea that the entire planet was in a transition at the same time, which is one reason that this book ended up catching a whirl. But it also taught me is that the piles of donuts. At the moment, the entire planet was going through this, and so that was a collective involuntary life quake. But what I learned in the process is that so we've all been through a life quake, as I mentioned earlier, in the last 3 years. The difference is that it affects us in different ways. Okay, so you might have lost a loved one. You might have lost, a company that you built suddenly didn't want, remote work was changing it. You might have moved, right? So the different people, even these collective life quakes that we're all going through, affect each of us in a different way, and that's just a message if you're trying to help someone go through an experience like this, to know that we all experience them. The pile of donuts looks differently to every person because somebody might be gluten-free, right? And somebody else may love donuts.
So can we talk a little bit about the perspective on transitions? For the person in transition, they're huge.
Yeah.
But I often think for those of us who are looking outside, maybe not the case. And
Yes.
the question came to my mind because I think about like when a child goes from kindergarten to first grade,
Yeah.
to them it's a big deal, or from preschool to kindergarten. But the parent looking kind of knows it's not that big a deal, but we know it's a big deal.
Yes.
Or now, with the benefit of like, how do you both hold on to being empathetic
Nice.
to the person in transition,
Nice.
but also maybe offer some perspective? Like that's a very, I'm sure there's some wisdom there about how to thread that needle.
Well, I love that. I mean, and I think that, in the work that you do, I mean, it would be interesting, and if we were in a different time and place, right, doctors make bad patients and lawyers make bad clients. I mean, on the one hand, people who are professionals like you have a lot of pattern recognition, and then it makes me wonder whether you're good at transitions because you help other people, or whether you do need outside eyes, because I do think you need outside eyes often. So let me just set the stage by saying this. So what did I say? Half of us, we've now established, make a 212-item to-do list. A quarter of us lie under the covers in the fetal position with a cat, and recognize it, and a quarter of us do that and don't recognize it. Okay, that's what we've established here this morning. But you look at enough patterns, look at enough of these, and certain patterns become clear. And so the first is that these transitions involve certain phases, okay? And I call them the long goodbye, where you mourn and use rituals, Rabbi, to mark and honor the past that's not coming back. Then there's a messy middle, where you shed certain habits and create new habits. And then there's a new beginning, and you mentioned beginnings earlier, where you unveil your new self and kind of and update the story that you tell about yourself, adding a new chapter. And depending on how the conversation goes, when we open it up for questions in a few minutes, we can talk about that. So these are these three phases, and these are part of a life transition. And here's the thing, so the big way to understand this is that the life quake kind of puts you on your heels, and the life transition puts you on your toes, right? So back when you're attacking, like the transition is the human response to the life quake, is sort of the frame to have here. And by the way, in the first 100 years people talked about transitions, the idea was that you had to go through whatever phases, these are my names for them, in order. Okay, Arnold van Gennep was a German anthropologist who kind of invented the phrase rites of passage in 1909, and he said that the way transitions worked was you were in one room, and then you walk down a hallway, and then you enter a new room. Okay, that's totally wrong, and that's completely misleading, and I actually would say harmful. Let's just take a transition that everybody recognizes, divorce. Okay, and let's say you're divorced, as someone in my extended family is going through right now with young children. Okay, so in the model, the Van Gennep model, like you're married with a family, then you all go, in your separate ways, and then you end up in new families and that. But that's not how it works. Okay, because as we know, some people in the family are cheating on their spouse, which means they're in the new room while they haven't technically left the old room, okay? And even if you do things in order and you separate and then maybe you get new relationships, or maybe one of the people in the relationships wants to be dating someone of the same sex and not the opposite sex, or whatever it might be, if you have children, you're constantly going from the new room back to the old room to deal with the children, right? So the point is that these events are nonlinear. People go through them in their own quixotic, individual pathway, okay? And that's the thing. And so where do you start? Everybody's good at one and bad at one of these phases. You have a kind of what I call a transition superpower and a transition kryptonite. So those of you that are 212 item to-do list people, okay, you're probably good at the messy middle. Okay, if I had to guess, Josh, you're good at the messy middle. You're going to make lists. You're going to attack it. You're going to form a structure because you have an analytical mind. But what that means is you're probably blowing through the idea that there's also emotions that you're dealing with and that you have to mourn the past. So you can't just messy middle your way through it. Also, you have to go through the emotions. And the other people that are under the covers, it's probably very emotional for you, and you're probably not going to get out from under the covers without realizing that you're dealing with the top three emotions, which are shame, or like the top three emotions are fear. How am I going to get through this? How am I going to live without my legs? How am I going to live without my loved one? I really needed the money from that job or the status that I got from it. The second is shame. I'm ashamed what I did when I was drunk. I'm ashamed that my child has an anxiety disorder. I'm ashamed that I lost my job and I have to ask my friends and loved ones for help. And then that's actually the third. The second is sadness. I'm just sad. I miss that. So we use rituals to mark those occasions. The people under the covers, you're probably going to be quicker to identify that it's emotional, and what gets you out of it is realizing that you can put those emotions behind you, but then you're going to have to make your to-do list in the messy middle. So that's go in whatever order. Now, I've done all of this to say that the 7 tools that are in my book, which you can follow up with later, are broadly speaking aligned with the 3 stages. Like market, accept it and market, that's the past, and shed habits and create, and that's the middle, and update your story, whatever, is the new beginning. But there's one essential part of it, which is not connected to a time that is valuable in all the times, and that's share your story. Share your experience with someone. Don't go through it alone. And so what happened is I was listening to these stories over and over again, and now is there something that was not in the literature that I think was kind of a fresh thing that came out of these conversations I was having, which is that people want different things from the people they're sharing it with. Okay, that some people they want comforters. Okay, I love you, Lynn. I believe in you. You're going to get through this. Okay, that's comfort. Okay, but some people respond to nudging. I love you, Lynn, but don't you think it's time, you thought about this, right? Or maybe you should consider that, or maybe what you're trying isn't exactly working. So that's not comfort, it's comforting, but it's also a nudging, because it's like, I'll take your hand and I'll hold you and I'll help. And then some respond to what I call slappers, which is, okay, Lynn, enough. You've been like stuck in this place for a long time. It's really time you need to do this, okay? It's time to go to AA, right? It's time to, consider looking for a new job. It's time that you finally cut down the rose bushes, that they're not going to come back, whatever it might be. So I think that the key thing is, and this comes back to like you've all heard the 5 love languages from Gary Chapman. I've oddly played a kind of a bit role in the 5 love languages, is because when I got married, my Baptist bookkeeper in Georgia gave me a copy of the 5 love languages. And if you've never seen the book, it's like the tackiest thing you've ever seen. It looks like it comes free at a truck stop, in rural Georgia. In fact, Gary Chapman is a Baptist preacher from North Carolina. But when we moved, funnily enough, 10 years into marriage, I opened this thing up, and dang if it didn't like totally nail something that was going on in my marriage, right? So my wife likes words of affirmation, which is, I love you, you're doing a good job, or whatever. And I like quality time, right? So her take on this is, it takes you 2 minutes to give me what I want, and you're resistant to do it, but I got to give you an hour. Like, I got totally the short end of the stick, right? But and so I wrote a piece about this in the New York Times, which was the first bit of national publicity that the 5 love languages ever got, and it helped blow the thing up into what it is today. And Gary's just the most wonderful man. Gives all the money actually to charity. So what Gary says in the 5 love languages is that you're in a relationship with someone who has a different love language from you. Like, that's the natural way that we do it. And I think the same thing is when support. So when you're offering support, you might want comforting, but the person you're with or advising may want nudging. Or worse, you might like slapping. You might like telling someone tough love, but what they're looking for is comfort. So I think when you're going through it, and this is your point about being an observer, don't just assume that what you would want in that situation is what the person you're helping would want. My way of thinking about it is ask before you advise. Say, do you want me to offer you support, or do you want me to, give you a 3-item to-do list? That is the most important thing. I think that gets to the point of when you're going through, don't belittle it. You're just moving from kindergarten to first grade, right? It's not going to be that big of a deal in 5 years, because it is a big deal for that person, and what is it that they need to get through it.
Great. So let me ask you one thing, and then I want to transition to get folks involved here. So what do you say to the person who's sitting there saying, this all makes a lot of sense, like, I'm with you, this is great, but I don't think I can do that?
Thank you very much for coming. Have a great afternoon. I would say it's not linear. And the expectation that it is an efficient thing that you can get through is what's going to harm you. Because you are getting through it. The fact that you're here listening to this suggests you're open to it. The fact that you recognize that you're in pain. The fact that you are willing to talk about it with somebody. That this is the human response. I asked people in my conversations, how long did it take? There were a handful of people that said I'm still in it, either because they were in the 5 years or because something has happened to extend it. But everybody had an answer, which means 98% of people, I don't have the number at the top of my head from my book, did feel that they got through it and got to another place. Actually, we are adept at it. We've all gotten through the pandemic. It may not be where we wanted to be, but we all have gotten through it, and we are all making the changes, and we're only 3 years into it, actually. Now we're told by the WHO on Friday that it's officially over. So I think you are getting through it, and it sort of reminds me of, let's just take grief. I lost my father 18 months ago. And, what it reminds me of is the first moment when you're in grief that you laugh, or you feel the day is beautiful, or you notice the blooms, right? You feel bad almost at first. Like, I can't be joyful. This is supposed to be a time of mourning and sadness. But as we all know, these celebrations, these experiences actually also allow us to find joy. The problem with the 5 stages of grief is that people feel if I'm not doing it in that order, that I'm wrong, and we've pathologized that. Like, well, first I'm supposed to feel anger, and then I'm supposed to feel, acceptance, and then I'm supposed to feel, whatever the 5 things are. By the way, the 5 stages of grief were not even designed for grief. The 5 stages of grief by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross were originally created from people who were dying. It was the terminally ill. It was not the survivors, and it just switched from being how people accept terminal illness to how they accept grief, and it doesn't apply. It's not linear. So the way to feel if you can't feel that way is to say, this is how I feel today, but it's not necessarily how I felt 2 days ago, and it's not necessarily how I'm going to feel 2 days from now.
Great, thank you. So I'd love to open it up and see what kind of questions folks have for Bruce. Do we have a mic that we can walk around with,
this
or
mic?
is that, so here, I'll run that, you
Okay,
take
fine.
that one. Okay, anybody have a question that they'd like to ask? Don't be shy. Please.
I'm interested in those people who are seeking comfort, and is it your responsibility to move them from comfort to nudging, or if many times we have family members who they go, I don't want you to tell me what to do, I want you to just comfort me, which works for the first, 20 times you say it, and then doesn't. And is it your responsibility for people who you love to offer a solution to move people who seem to be stuck? Or you don't accept the idea that they're stuck. I don't know, that's a possibility. So.
Well, first of all, I appreciate that. And let me just say, a couple of things. I think that the essential, we're talking about 2 people here. We're talking about the person going through it, and then we're talking about the person trying to help the person going through it, okay? So let me separate those 2 questions, because I think your question is primarily about the person trying to help the other person going through it. But let me first of all say that the essential act of going through a transition is the act of updating, rethinking, and revising and retelling your life story, okay? So that you add a chapter into your life story that I was that, and then I went through this transition, and now I am this, okay? On the joyful side is, I was a person who was an individual. Then I was a person who was married, and now I'm a person who is an individual and am married, but also now have 2 newborn identical girls that I'm responsible for. So that's the transition, and I have to write that story. You cannot write that story for me under any circumstances. I have to do it. The essence of the story of what you want to do in your work, which is the essence of my new book, The Search. You have to write that story. And I bring that up because I interviewed and what that book does is give you a set of tools to be able to, I call it 21 questions to find work you love, that will help you figure out what is the story of work that you have inherited and been telling your whole life, and how can you add the next chapter. And I interviewed in that process, the dean of modern career counseling, and he said to me, when I meet somebody and they're looking for work and they're stuck and they're unhappy with what they do, I know within 5 minutes what they should do, but it is not my job to tell them. It is my job to be useful to help them tell it themselves. So I think this is sort of the latest thinking about how this is that we have to do it ourselves. So that's the individual, and I think that cannot be changed. What is the role of the person trying to help? Because you are trying to help. Saying my way or the highway obviously is not going to work, but you still want to be helpful, and maybe you see patterns that they don't see because you're a rabbi or because you're a parent and you see patterns in your children, or because you are a coach or a neighbor or a sobriety coach or whatever it might be. I think here, the way that I would think about it, it's funny because I've just drawn a story from my new book, The Search. I would go back to The Secrets of Happy Families, which is my book on how families, how families can function better, which I should say Josh appears in a charming and helpful way. And there I have this thing called the care and feeding of grandmothers, right? And I have this because I have a mother and I have a mother-in-law who were both involved, and shall we say, my in-laws' parents, friends are here. They are, and this is nothing I didn't say, put in the New York Times, they are opinionated, right? And so like, what am I going to do about this, right? So my mother's position was, oh, I'm not going to tell you what I think. My mother-in-law would tell me exactly what she thinks, and and again, they're both, it's wrong for both of them, right? I said to my mother, you're not a very good actress. So what you think is quite obvious, okay? And here I go back to a lesson. I'm a professional writer. I've written, 15 books and 7 New York Times bestsellers. And I get a lot of feedback, I get it on Amazon, I get it from friends, I get it from critics, I get a lot of feedback. So when I'm working on a piece of writing, it's helpful for me to show it to other people. And I have learned a very simple phrase that has saved my life countless times, which is, I'm going to give it to you, and I'm going to say to you, number one, I'm only going to give it to you if you believe I can do it, right? So I'm only going to ask you advice about getting through this transition if you believe that I can get through it, I'm willing to listen to anything from you. So that's the first thing I would do if you're giving this advice. I believe in you, and I'm always here from you. And then the second thing I'm going to say to you is, we're going to make a pact. I'm going to give you permission to say whatever you want on the condition that you give me permission to not listen to this advice. And that's the pact. And what I have learned is essential is that this pact does not work if it's unspoken. So speak the pact. So I say to my mother, you can say whatever you want about how I'm raising your grandchildren, on the condition that you realize that this is the decision of the parents of that grandchildren and not yours. Your job is to be their grandmother, not to be their mother, okay? And their mother might have different beliefs about this, but she gets to be the mother. So the answer is, first of all, I believe in you. Second, I'm going to tell you what I think you might want to do, accepting that you might not accept it. And then for you, your way to uphold that pact is, if they don't take your advice, you still have to be supportive. And you can't, I told you so, if they don't listen to your advice and it doesn't go well.